Madam President.
Senator from Texas is recognized.
Madam President, I rise today to discuss the protests we've seen erupt in Cuba over the past several days. On Sunday, shouts of libertad, freedom, were heard in dozens of cities and towns all over Cuba as people took to the streets to protest the communist government that has had a stranglehold on that nation for 62 years. This socialist regime has tortured, killed, silenced, denied freedom, and driven into exile generations of Cubans, forcing many, including my family, to flee or to be murdered. It has cut off Cuba from the rest of the world. It has destroyed its economy so that today Cubans stand in long lines for food, for medicine, for basic supplies. They endure energy blackouts, and government officials can shut off their censored internet service at a whim, as they did Sunday when the regime panicked about the protests. This battle for freedom is personal to me. When Fulgencio Batista staged a coup in Cuba and became a brutal dictator in the 1950s, my father fought against his regime. My dad was imprisoned and tortured. His captors broke his nose and bashed in his front teeth so they were dangling from his mouth. My father fled Cuba, the country he had fought for and had been brutalized trying to save. And in 1957, my father came to the United States. He came to Texas with $100 sewn into his underwear. He had nothing. He attended the University of Texas on a student visa and got a job washing dishes, making 50 cents an hour. In the summer of 1959, soon after Castro had taken over Cuba, my father returned to visit his family, and he was horrified by what he saw. It quickly became evident that Castro was even worse than Batista had been. My father's sister, my tia Sonia, was still there, and she became part of the counter-revolution against Castro. Like her brother, my tia Sonia was thrown in prison, and she was tortured by Castro's goons. Growing up, my cousin Bibi and I used to sit at the feet of my dad and my tia Sonia and hear stories about their fight for freedom. Hear their stories about battling in Cuba, just like the heroic protesters on the streets are doing today. The freedom of America was the dream that allowed them to endure the brutality of Cuba. America was and is a beacon of hope for all of those who, like them, have endured oppression. And that is why we saw so many protesters in Cuba flying American flags on Sunday, because the American flag is a symbol of hope in Havana, in Hong Kong, and all across the globe. America must respond. Over the past few days, the world has seen that the American people, we stand squarely with the men and women of Cuba in their noble fight for liberty. Worryingly, however, the Biden administration has stopped short of strong, clear support for the brave protesters marching in the street, and has been reluctant to issue clear and unequivocal condemnation for the communist dictatorship that oppresses those people. In statement after statement, as protesters swept into the streets, literally risking their lives to stand for freedom, administration officials have issued lukewarm and guarded statements. After being shamed into finally taking stronger positions, President Biden finally put out a statement saying that the protesters were exercising their right to peaceful assembly. But even that is wrong. In Cuba, they have no right to peaceful assembly because the Cuban dictatorship is out there arresting the protesters right now. It's out there beating the protesters right now. It's out there imprisoning the protesters right now. They are speaking with great courage, and the communist dictatorship is doing everything it can to silence what they're saying. The Biden administration has also said the protests are about COVID-19 vaccines. That unfortunately doesn't even pass the laugh test. Just this week, the White House press secretary said the protests were about misadministration in Cuba, mismanagement. Well, the last I checked, the protesters in the streets weren't chanting, "Manage better." They were chanting libertad, freedom. They were chanting, "Down with the dictatorship." America has a unique role in the world, a role to provide leadership, a role to speak the truth. And at times of inflection, at times when people are risking their lives for freedom, the leadership of America matters. Here's what President Biden needs to say to the Cuban people. To the Cuban people, we stand with you. To the Cuban people, you are right that you have a right to liberty. You have a right to speech. You have a right to worship. You have a right to live your lives and raise your children and be free of oppression and torture and murder. And President Biden needs to go on to say, the communist dictatorship that oppresses you is evil. Period, full stop. In my Senate office, I have a large painting of President Ronald Reagan standing in front of the Brandenburg Gate. And above the gate, in the style of the graffiti that was on the Berlin Wall, are the words, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." American leadership matters, and it is heard in the darkest recesses. Some years ago, I sat down with Natan Sharansky, the famed Soviet dissident. He and I sat down together in Jerusalem, and he told me when he was in a gulag in the Soviet Union that prisoners would pass from cell to cell notes. Did you hear what Reagan said? Evil empire, ash heap of history, tear down this wall. Presidential silence is heard in Cuba, and presidential clarity is heard in Cuba. I want to close by reading a text that I got this week from my mom. My mom and our family is in communication with family friends still in Cuba. Here's what a close friend of the family said. Things are much more serious than what is reported on TV. This friend of the family described that she has no food. Same for almost everyone. Yesterday, she had a bowl of thin soup, nothing more. She was asking for help for the first time. No way to get money to Cuba. Banks are closed. 5 protesters were killed in Santiago. Radio stations are being taken over by protesters. Internet shut down, so no further contact available. Matanzas, where my father was born, is a hot spot for COVID, and it sounds as though desperate times are generating desperate measures. To the people of Cuba, I want you to know your message is being heard. Your bravery is being seen. And it's worth it. This is potentially an inflection point. And America should stand up and speak boldly on the side of freedom. There's a reason those protesters carry our flags. There is a reason they look to America as a beacon of hope and freedom across the globe. To the people of Cuba, we stand with you. You have a right to be free, and your courage is inspiring. We are inspired by you and the evil thugs who are on the street brutalizing you. They too will end up in the ash heap of history. The oppression in Cuba will fall, and we will once again see a Cuba Libre, a free Cuba, thanks to the courage and heroism of the Cubans in the street. I yield the floor.
Thank the gentleman. I'll now go to Mr. Fluker from Texas, 5 minutes.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman, Secretary. Thank you for being here. Would you consider yourself the principal advisor to the president for energy matters?
I'm the Secretary of Energy. I'm one of the main advisors, but he's got a few.
But you're the principal advisor.
Well, I don't know that I would say that. I think he's got some
The
very
Secretary of
good
Energy.
advisors in the White
I
House.
believe in this position. I represent the Permian Basin. We've had this conversation before. We produce about 43% of the country's crude oil. It's the most secure supply of oil and gas in the entire world. And in fact, I would also go a step further, that it's probably the only thing that has kept this economy going despite the policies that we've seen. Very concerned about those policies, and I just have a couple of questions for you. Based on, being the Secretary of Energy, when the president went to Saudi Arabia and asked OPEC Plus to increase production, was that your recommendation to him to do that?
I think the president wanted to see greater production in the United States also.
We have that ability.
And
That's why
he's
HR1
been asking
is so
for it.
important. And Madam Secretary, you are the Secretary of Energy. We are blessed as a country to have the most enormous amount of reserves, not just of oil and gas, but of so many other critical minerals and things that have been discussed today. Did you recommend that he go to Saudi Arabia and ask for them to produce more oil?
I was not in that conversation.
So he did not ask the Secretary of Energy for
I was
your
not in that
recommendation?
conversation. But I will say this, he has been very strong about asking for greater supply here in the United States.
And we have that capacity to do that. I'm extremely troubled with the fact that for a political emergency, the president released over half of our SPR. At what point in time will you make a recommendation to the president or act upon current law to refill?
We will be refilling, as
Do
you're
you have a timeline?
as soon as we're finished with the current congressionally mandated sale, which we are required to do before the end of the fiscal year. As soon as that's done, because as you're probably aware, you can't take in and release at the same time, we will begin the
I'd
process.
like for you to follow up
refilling.
for the record on that one to let us know what that timeline looks like. I'm going to move to the next question.
Starting this summer.
You said we cannot flip a switch today, but the administration has actually tried to flip that switch. Just a couple of questions for you when it comes to what's the total amount of electricity that our country needs on an annual basis?
Well, right now we have about 1,400 gigawatts on our grid.
On an annual basis, what does that equate to?
Well, 1,400 gigawatts on the grid, so how much electricity we have a bunch of different sources of electricity that are provided. We use about three.
It's about 4 trillion kilowatt hours per year. And I would expect you to know that because when we have a 2032 mandate to get to electric vehicles like my colleague just mentioned, my next question is, what will the increase in that total amount of annual
We have to
demand
double
be?
the size of the electric grid by 2035.
Double. So what portion of our grid is serviced by hydrocarbons right now?
About 40% is natural gas, about 17% is coal, and the rest is clean.
Okay, so it's about 20%, 22% coal,
Nope,
19% nuclear.
17%. It's as of right now.
This is from y'all's website.
Well,
38% natural gas and
anyway.
20% renewable. So what in 2032, if we have to double, and thank you for that answer. That's actually more than I was expecting you to say. If we have to double the amount of electricity, where is that going to come from?
That's going to come from growing our energy pie.
In what pieces
Increasing-
of pie will grow?
We want to increase clean.
Clean. So what does that mean? What is
So
clean?
that means let's increase nuclear. Let's increase hydroelectric power. Let's increase
What about,
geothermal.
what
Let's
about in places
increase-
that don't have hydro?
Well, that's why you have a transmission grid, to be able to bring electricity from where it's generated to where it's needed.
When's the last time you visited the Permian Basin?
I have not been to the Permian
It's the
Basin.
most prolific production area for energy in this country.
Will you invite me?
I have invited you.
I didn't know
I
that.
invited you last year when I saw you in a meeting,
Great.
and I'll invite you again. This area helped us win World War II. This area has lifted 1 billion people out of poverty. This administration is choosing to not use the best of the above strategy. I'm not an all of the above kind of person. I'm a best of the above. And that's different for different places. Hydrocarbons in some places, clean natural gas, maybe if you have hydroelectric. We have more wind energy in my congressional district than the entire state of California. Come see it. It doesn't always work. The wind in West Texas in July when it's 110 degrees in the middle of summer doesn't blow,
But your sun shines.
but it does. And give me a battery that works for more than 4 hours that services the
We're working on
largest
that.
electric grid in the country.
Yeah.
We don't want to be like Europe. We don't want to be like California. That's why we're trying to use a best of the above approach. My time has expired, but I would like to see, Mr. Chairman, the timeline for when the SPR is going to be refilled. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. We'll go to Mr. Carter from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate you letting me wave on to this committee. Madam Secretary, thank you.
Em không đi tìm người yêu lý tưởng đâu anh. Em không đi tìm người yêu tuyệt đối đâu anh. Em không đi tìm người yêu nhan sắc mỹ miều, người yêu đai các cao sang, lụa lá gấm hoa vàng son. Em không đi tìm người yêu đôi trắng thay đen. Em không đi tìm người yêu say đắm xa hoa. Em không đi tìm người yêu cao quý ngọc ngà, lầu cao xe các anh ơi, có gì vẫn luôn vững bền. Anh ơi, em tìm người yêu chung thủy, em tìm người yêu trong mơ, dẫu nghèo nguyện không đổi lòng. Anh ơi, biết rằng ở đời ai không muốn đẹp giàu và cao sang, vì em nghèo đâu dám mơ. Anh ơi, em tìm người yêu không ước mơ cao. Anh ơi, em tìm người yêu thương mái tranh xiêu. Mai đây cho dù rằng đời góc bế chân trời, cuộc đời bão táp phong ba, suốt đời có nhau bên mình. Em không đi tìm người yêu lý tưởng đâu anh. Em không đi tìm người yêu tuyệt đối đâu anh. Em không đi tìm người yêu nhan sắc mỹ miều, người yêu đai các cao sang, lụa lá gấm hoa vàng son. Em không đi tìm người yêu đôi trắng thay đen, em không đi tìm người yêu say đắm xa hoa. Em không đi tìm người yêu cao quý ngọc ngà, lầu cao xe các anh ơi, có gì vẫn luôn vững bền. Anh ơi, em tìm người yêu chung thủy, em tìm người yêu trong mơ, dẫu nghèo nguyện không đổi lòng. Anh ơi, biết rằng ở đời ai không muốn đẹp giàu và cao sang, vì em nghèo đâu dám mơ. Anh ơi, em tìm người yêu không ước mơ cao, anh ơi em tìm người yêu thương mái tranh xiêu. Mai đây cho dù rằng đời góc bế chân trời, cuộc đời bão táp phong ba, suốt đời có nhau bên mình. Mai đây cho dù rằng đời góc bế chân trời, cuộc đời bão táp